Prague is a symbolic location to organize conferences like these. Prague was the place where the light of freedom was switched off the latest in 1948 in Central and East Europe. And after a failed attempt to put it on again in 1968, it was put on again finally in 1989. And now Prague secures the light in Europe, the light of freedom. The light of freedom will be preserved in the European Union, which is in an organization which is in the name of the free market, gradually introducing a highly regulated and protectionist economic system. So Prague will remain the light in the new darkness of the European Union, maybe. It is also a great honor for me to deliver the Wieser lecture. As you probably know, and that was already mentioned by the former speakers, Wieser was a prominent member of the Austrian school. Together with Böhm-Bawerk, he groomed the next generation of that school with famous scholars such as von Mises, Hayek, and Schumpeter. Although I do not consider myself as a full-time Austrian economist, as I am involved in law and economics, where I have to rely considerably on the neoclassical and institutionalist tradition in this field, I follow this school in her broad views on economic analysis and political economy, such as, for instance, the superiority of markets in the allocation of resources and the use of knowledge, the subjective value theory, its skepticism towards fiat money and central banking, its emphasis on a government limited to maintaining a system of abstract rules. One of von Mises' contributions to the stock of economic analytical tools is the notion of opportunity cost, mentioned also by the introducer. Opportunity costs are alternative costs. By introducing this notion, a theory of rational choice compatible with value subjectivism could be developed. It would be interesting to study in how far von Wieser contributed in this respect to the discipline of law and economics. Maybe a good theme for a thesis for a student, for a scholar. This great Austrian scholar deserves certainly more esteem in the intellectual world than he actually has. The title of my lecture, the title of my lecture is Hayek in China. The lecture is, of course, not dealing with history, as Hayek has never been in China and would, during his active lifetime, probably not have been welcome over there. But as a Belgian, however, I like such a title, as I have been raised with comics such as Tintin in the Soviet Union, and Suske and Wiske, Francis and Louisa in Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia was the comics version of Czechoslovakia in the time. These two comics albums were very anti-communist albums and probably have exerted a deep influence on my thinking. And that's the reason why I like the title Hayek in China. In my lecture, I tried to show first that in China, a deep evolution from a concrete, planned order towards an abstract order in a Hayekian sense is occurring, first point. And secondly, that the emergence of this abstract order is not the result of planning itself. It's not the result of a constructivist reshaping of institutions, of society, but it is the result of a process of improvisation in which collectivist leadership introduced small reforms at the margin, which triggered off unintended consequences by which collectivist leaders were induced to introduce new reforms, and an invisible hand guided collectivist leaders from plan to market, from a socialist society to a capitalist one, and as we may hope, from dictatorship to limited government based on the rule of law and a pluralist democracy. In my lecture, I will spend first, as way of introduction, some attention to the Austrian Hayekian notion of abstract order and concrete order, and then I will illustrate the evolution from concrete planned order in China towards an abstract order on three main fields. First, the emergence of private enterprise. Secondly, the gradual emergence of property institutions. And third, the emergence of contractual law order. The notion of abstract order is one of the major Austrian contributions to political economy, and it is especially Hayek who developed very profound thoughts about this notion. By developing the notion of abstract order, the Austrian school was able to reconcile the notion of order and freedom. In the 30s, for instance, order and freedom were mostly seen as antagonist notions. Either you have freedom and chaos, or you have order and authority. And it is thanks to the Austrian school that the notion of order was made compatible with libertarian thinking. And the attention to this distinction is in this way also a yardstick towards freedom and progress in the world. And the more operational abstract orders are effective in countries, the more the basis is laid for a free society. What do we understand by an abstract order? An abstract order is a connection between abstract categories of actions, which allows us to explain things in patterns, explanations. So it's not an order between two concrete types of actions, but between two very general categories. An abstract order has also, in the Austrian Hayekian sense, two meanings, and the correlation, the connection between two has to be explored, of course, much more by law and economics, for instance. The abstract order, in the first place, means an order of coordination. Coordination of actions which are not governed by rules, but by self-interest, by the self-interest of rational man. And this is, of course, the main field of economics. Economics defined here as a science of unintended consequence. That is the first meaning of an abstract order, a wide order in which acting man is coordinating his actions with the actions of other participants to this abstract order. For instance, the rise of prices may cause a fall of demand. This is an expression in terms of aggregates, of economic aggregates, but in fact it points to coordination of actions by concrete acting beings, people who are adjusting their prices to a general, they're adjusting their preferences to a general pattern of the suppliers who are increasing their prices. So it's a coordination of action. It's not an abstract correlation between two aggregates which are outside acting man. The rise of corporate tax, for instance, will cause an exit of the most mobile factors of production, is also such a type of, an example of coordination of action. But the abstract order is also operational through rule-guided behavior. And that is the abstract order in another sense within the Hayekian thinking. And this type of abstract order is, of course, much more topic of law and the economic analysis of the law. For instance, an abstract, rule-guided abstract order, an example is the rule of contractual compliance. This is a very general rule, pacta sunt servanda. And here, this rule-guided behavior results in a connection between two general patterns of actions. First, the making of a contract, and secondly, a general pattern of actions, the compliance of contracts. So in society, actions become more or less, general actions become more or less predictable, but only in a very general way. If this rule-guided behavior is generalized in society, you can count on the fact that when people make promises, make a contract, that people will follow this contract, these promises. For instance, the rule of tort law, abstract order of damages and compensation. It's an abstract rule which is comprising a lot of concrete cases and concrete actions, which connects these two types of action, causing damages and compensation by the other party. The science of an abstract order allows a kind of prediction, but this prediction is limited to abstract patterns of action, the so-called pattern explanation, as Hayek developed this notion. You can only predict that if a certain type of an abstract category of actions occurs in society, then this will be followed by another type of action with another abstract characteristic. And it is because this prediction is quite limited that this type of prediction is not really liked by concrete planners who like to see the society as a kind of machinery, and if you push on one button, you will have another concrete result. And that is something which, of course, the science of the abstract order economics cannot provide. For instance, kind of pattern, examples of pattern explanation are the rise of the price will cause a drop in demand. But it's not possible to explain how much to explain that in strict, stable, quantitative relationships. The imposition of a contractual compliance rule will, of course, push society to more compliance, but you cannot predict which concrete contracts will result in more compliance. You can only predict a general tendency towards more compliance, but a concrete predictions are not possible. And this is, of course, a limitation towards the predictive capacity of economics, this notion of pattern explanation. The notion of an abstract and spontaneous order is a strong argument. This is a conference on political economy, so we may make the link towards politics, towards institution. It's a strong argument for limited government, because if an abstract order is possible, there is no need really for an authority in society imposing a concrete order, like, for instance, we have this in an army. Society is not an army. That is basically the message of this science of the abstract order. The main task for government is providing side condition for the abstract order in the sense of coordination of action to function to the benefit of most by relentless and undiscriminated enforcement of abstract rules necessary for the abstract order to function. This is a very powerful argument for freedom. Abstract rules and complementary institution who are necessary for an coordination, abstract order of coordination to function are we are very familiar with it. These are property rights, a very good system, clear system of property rights, delineation of property rights, contractual compliance, a good working tort system, preventing externalization and exportation of costs, a good working, efficient litigation system, putting ends towards conflicts and avoiding lasting conflicts within society, and also an effective system of protection agencies within society. This is the bundle of institutions we need in order that the abstract order of the market can function effectively. How the concrete content for the concrete context of these institutions, there is no Bible. There is no Bible that evolves within cultures, and very important cultural path dependencies are important in this case. So there is no absolute Bible about the concrete content of this type of institution that depends on the culture within it is evolving. An abstract order, and that's a side argument, is not either an argument for political unification style European Union, because sometimes these notions of an abstract order and market order are misused in order to impose centralization in the European Union. The side conditions for an abstract order can be provided by a cooperation between different independent political firms, states. There are, for instance, other techniques than unification, like, for instance, developing a law of legal conflict, what to do if one conflict has aspects which are relied to more legal systems. Therefore, we have traditions of the law of legal conflicts. There are also examples of bottom-up unification of the law by restatements that is going on in Europe, where scholars of different countries are getting together and working out restatements on tort law, on contract law, and these restatements are sent around to institutions, to parliaments, and so on, in order eventually to adapt their institutions. This is a bottom-up unification of the law, so political centralization is not at all necessary in order to get this wide abstract order throughout Europe. The European Union is probably the first example in the world where you will get a kind of economic dictatorship in the name of promotion of free market. A very paradoxical evolution. We move now to China. China between 49 and 79, I'm born in the former century, so I'm not mentioning the century, was a communist country and was in fact guided by the idea of a concrete order, imposing a concrete order in society, a planned society with collective goals and working out these collective goals by very concrete implementation. With regard to industrialization, the Chinese system was much similar to the Soviet system in Eastern Europe. It was forced industrialization based on squeezing the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector was taxed all over the head in order to progress with a very quick industrialization. So that is quite similar to the Soviet Union. However, on the countryside, agriculture, there are remarkable differences with the Soviet Union, and that is, it's advisable to spend some attention to the countryside of China, to the agricultural sector, because the gradual development towards an abstract order, a market order, starts over there. Some historical facts about the evolution of communism in China. Between 49 and 58, collectivization of land was imposed around cooperatives, agriculture production communities. They meant forced pooling of land in cooperatives, but the farmers were paid, could share the output according to the input of land and the input of labor, which, of course, gave a lot of power to the bureaucrats who were distributing these points of labor, as it was called, because that entitled you to a share of the output. But more or less, this collectivization left intact a lot of family production patterns. It's only in 58 that our great chairman Mao Zedong, who was losing power, designed the Great Leap Forwards and forced all these smaller cooperatives into much larger communes between 10,000 and 80,000 people. They were subdivided by brigades of 1,000, 2,000 people. And the output system, the distribution of the output was changed. 60% was free supply on an equal base, and 40% on labor. You can imagine what impact this had on incentives of people to work also. But there were other unintended consequences of this great leap forwards. For instance, Chairman Mao ordered the farmers to kill all the birds because the birds were eating the seeds. And the result was, of course, that a lot of the insects were not killed by the birds, which led to a big famine in China, which killed about 20 million people. We should really, we should not forget how crank collectivist dictators can impose such a disaster on a whole society. 20 million people, that's more than a Holocaust. So there is some base to say, well, if you are in favor of defense of the Holocaust denial, you should also apply this to the Holocaust of Mao Zedong. So this created a lot of disturbance within the Chinese economy. Chairman Mao was ousted from power temporarily, unfortunately. And between 60 and 79, a more moderate system was again implemented, attaching much more value also to the input of labor and reintroducing partially private plots, which produced disproportionately a lot of agriculture output. And in 79, finally, there is the great swing where Deng Xiaoping abolished the whole system of the communes and introduced the household responsibility system. Which is a very important turning point in the evolution. The household responsibility system implies that farmer families get their own plots, not in very strong property rights. They get a kind of leasehold on plots. They have to sell part of their production on fixed prices to the central government in order, for instance, to supply the army with food. Secondly, they have to pay taxation for the common infrastructure, which is sometimes very important in Chinese agriculture, like, for instance, irrigation. You know, all the Marxist concept of the Asiatic mode of production, which is relying a lot on this public infrastructure. So they have to pay taxation in order to maintain this infrastructure like irrigation. And the rest they could sell on the market. So that was basically the switch of Deng Xiaoping, and here we are talking about millions and millions and millions of families. So that was a very important system. What should we learn from this historical evolution? In the first place, the commune system. The radical collectivist system only lasted 19 years, and 19 years is too short. It's not enough to affect deeply the Chinese family farming system. This is not even one generation. So the old habits, the old techniques was easily reinstated and reused when Deng Xiaoping was introducing his responsibility system. Also, the private knowledge, in agriculture. Why are planning systems failing in agriculture and sometimes having a success in some sectors, like, for instance, steel production? Look to Stalin. He was very successful in steel production in terms of quantity produced, and is a total failure in agriculture. It is in agriculture very concrete knowledge is involved. The value of land, what is the value of land? That depends on very concrete, sophisticated circumstances. A farmer knows his land. But if you reduce a farmer to a bureaucrat, this knowledge is lost. And you get a totally other pattern of production. A lot of private knowledge is used. Well, that was not the case. The farmers who were farming in the 60s were often the same farmers still in operation in 69, or their children who were educated in these farming techniques. So 19 years is really too short to destroy the knowledge and the habits of a more or less a non-collectivistic system. If you contrasted this with the Soviet Union, there the collectivization started in the 30s, and lasted until 91 when privatization was started. This is 60 years. There the disaster has been done. Generations and generations lost their agriculture tradition and their private knowledge. So this is a very important difference with the Soviet Union. So if we frame this now in terms, in Hayekian terms of order, in 79, what was the starting point of the further evolution in China? First, you had still this, in 79, this vast imposed industrial plant order, especially in the urban areas, while on the countryside you had a huge number of what I would call natural concrete orders, the family systems. They were more or less autarkic. They were not linked because markets were not allowed before, were repressed during 20 years. Or there were some small markets, especially local markets, regional markets. That was the starting point. But you had all kind of units which were natural, more or less. Family orders. Family orders means easy links of solidarity and low agency costs. You don't have to watch your son or your daughter closely because they will work for you, they work for the parents, especially within a Confucian morality. So that was the starting point in 79 of the privatization. And since 79, you have this accumulation of concrete reforms triggering off further consequences. And what is very clear is that the collective leadership of China never was converted to markets. There was nowhere a moment where the leaders in China said, well, I read the books of von Mises, of Hayek, of somebody else. Now we will introduce a market system. That never occurred. They were communists, and probably they still are communists and have a firm belief in central management of the country. But they had problems with production. They had problems with political unrest, especially after 89, with the collapse of communism somewhere else. And they were always changing the system on the margin. What's also very important is that they abandoned their belief in, or that the main aim should be equality and the creation of socialist man, but that the main aim should be economic growth. But the economic growth had to occur through collective management and not through markets. That was their belief. But step by step, they were forced to move always more in the direction of markets, a kind of co-evolution, economic unintended consequences which forced them to change the institution, and in this way they evolved towards a market system. And my first example is the development of private enterprise. In difference with the Soviet Union, the Chinese private enterprise is not the result of privatization. In the beginning, at least. Now it is. Now they are starting to privatize the industrial firms in the urban areas. But in the beginning, private enterprise is the result, the private enterprise is the result of a gradual transformation of collective enterprises, not private enterprise, very strange thing, collective enterprises which really emerged all over the countryside. And that's a very particular story for China. The initial center, the initial core of this development are the so-called CBEs, small brigades, introduced by Chairman Mao. If Chairman Mao had known that his introduction of the CBAs had triggered off capitalist development, he would turn himself in his grave. The CBEs were small brigades in the communes in order to produce all kinds of agriculture, machinery, tools, and so on, to dynamize the system on the countryside. But they were very limited. They could only employ 8 people. In 1977, the Communist Party emphasized more economic growth and abolished the limit of these brigades. And in 1984, the CBE became TVE, Town Village Enterprises. And also the legal framework of these CBEs were established. Maybe first some figures, just to say we are not talking about details. And if you see the evolution between 78 and 93, see the major shifts. State-owned enterprises were in 77% of the output of the Chinese economy. In 93, the shift towards non-state enterprise had occurred, and they were produced only 43%, while the non-state-owned enterprises were increasing and were producing 56% of the output. Here in the other, in the rest of the table, you see the type of enterprises. This is a difficult task to classify the types of enterprises in China. There are different definitions, but you see immediately the rise of township enterprises and village enterprises. Township can be a rural notion. It's a larger village, it's a larger or a part of a big city, from 5 to 14, from 4 to 12, also other enterprises. So there was a major shift in the type of enterprise producing the Chinese economic output. What is a TVE? It's a very strange thing. A TVE is an enterprise run by the local bureaucrats. The local bureaucrats, the major, the elderman, as we would call it in European terms, are leading the enterprise. Of course, in many cases, they delegate a lot of management tasks to special managers, but they decide about the enterprise, the policy and the policy of the enterprise. The law imposed them to reinvest the profits of the enterprise in the firm itself. So a kind of self-financing was imposed, and the rest of the profits had to be reinvested in local infrastructure, in kindergartens, and so on and so on. So there were no residual claimants as we have in a capitalist firm. For the rest, they were free to decide about their production, and they were free to look for markets to develop their own market strategy. That is the TV system. The TV system was seen by the Communist Party as a way of dynamizing the collectivist structure. It was never seen as a kind of beginning of development for a capitalist economy, but in fact they developed as such. The TVEs developed and created a huge market network throughout China. In the beginning, TVEs were working for local markets, but gradually their market strategy expanded And what you got within the collectivist system of China was a whole network of enterprises who were basically working on market principles, setting their prices freely, deciding freely about production, and having all kinds of connections between itself. So that's a very special evolution. The TVEs were a major success in terms of evolution within the Chinese economy, but you can of course ask, why are they like that? Why didn't they take the form of a capitalist firm? And there are a series of obvious reasons why they took this type of form. In the first place, they had to operate as a kind of collective firm in the first place because they were relying on the banks, and the banking system was in the 80s still a very socialistic system, which was not at all in favor of privatization and was reluctant to lend money to private firms. So it was better to clothe the private initiatives within a kind of bureaucratic veil in order to hide its, in fact, private enterprise character and present it as a part of the collectivist economy so they could get loans from the banking system. Secondly, the local bureaucrats, who had a lot of autonomy, which is also peculiar for the Chinese system. Professor Garello has written a good paper on this fiscal autonomy in China. The local bureaucrats have a lot of power in taxation policy and spending policy. And of course, they could squeeze eventually the enterprises. And in order to overcome this, it was better for private enterprise to co-opt the bureaucrats within the enterprise, so that to make the bureaucrats a kind of partner within the enterprise, so they would not be inclined to squeeze this enterprise. We call that from the grabbing to the helping hand. Third point, there is a very weak rule of law. I'll come back later to this point. If there were, for instance, legal conflicts about contracts and so on, mostly the bureaucracy would win this legal contest because there is no such thing as an independent judiciary in China, or there was no such thing as an independent judiciary. So they could not rely on that. So it was better to present themselves as a part of the collectivist system. So basically, and that's an interesting notion, the TVEs are a phenomenon of what I call bureaupreneurship. The bureaucrats were made entrepreneurs in a first phase within this collectivist system in order to evolve in a next phase towards full entrepreneurship. And then finally, in '94, the collectivist leadership saw the inconveniences of the TVEs, because the TVEs were really hitting the ceilings of their efficiency, and especially the combination of administrative tasks, like, for instance, running local infrastructure, schools, kindergartens, combined with productive work in the private sector. This combination proved to be the less and the less efficient, and the leadership then took the next step, and that is allowing privatization and designing a large legal framework for privatization. And from then on, the TVEs were very quickly transformed in full private enterprises. This is here you see the evolution of the share of the private sector, and from between '98 and 2003, real private enterprises, so not collective enterprises anymore, but real private enterprises really took the upper hand and produced the largest share of the economy. So what is the lesson of this first example? Is that a reform made at the margin of the collectivist system, really developed in a abstract order of enterprises, of a market system of private enterprise, and that triggered off new legal reforms. Sometimes, so the legal reforms were in fact a kind of unintended consequence of some economic reforms made at the margin of the collectivist system. Sometimes it's the opposite. For instance, look to the evolution in Europe with the famous Papal Revolution. The Papal Revolution analyzed by Harold Berman in his book Law and Revolution, which did not have the intent to create a market system in Europe, but to strengthen the power of the church, the introduction of Roman law. But the unintended consequence of this introduction of the Roman law was, of course, encouragement, a fostering of the market evolution within Europe. Second example, the property order. A property order is central to the evolution of a market order. That is a canon in the analysis of economic analysis of law. If now you look to China, what is the general pattern? That during the evolution towards private enterprise, towards the evolution to the expansion of markets, property institutions were particularly weak. It made no sense to go to the court in order to enforce your property rights. Because if the court was on the side of and was mostly on the side of the bureaucrats, they would not protect you. The Chinese judiciary is not perceived like we perceive a judiciary, as an independent instance, independent from the government, which is deciding conflicts between citizens and companies, in which the litigation is party-driven. This is, in China, is the judiciary is seen as another branch of the bureaucracy, which is government-driven. So if you had conflicts on property, you didn't go to, it wasn't possible to rely on the judiciary. Furthermore, the rural population, and this is still a problem in China, has weak property rights. Very weak property rights. They are not entitled, for instance, to mortgage their land, to free alienation. This is something the Chinese still have to solve. But then the question arises, how is it possible that a system of market, private enterprise, could develop within a framework of very weak property rights? Here you see that you can pinpoint a couple of other types of features of the system which were providing a de facto protection of property rights. In the first place, you had the cadre evaluation system of the bureaucrats. What is important for a bureaucrat? That is to move up within the bureaucratic ladder and to improve his income. What is one of the most important criteria in China to move up? There are two criteria. Public order, smash down opponents. That's the first point. And secondly, economic growth. So economic growth is a very important element to move up within the bureaucracy. So a bureaucrat, a local bureaucrat, has a particular interest to protect business in his constituency. So there is a kind of alignment of interests of the bureaucrat with the growth and with respect of property. You will not have economic growth within your circumscription if you are taxing people, if you're expropriating people the whole time. But if you leave them like they are, if you respect property rights, then you can show better figures to the hierarchy and eventually move up. Secondly, local autonomy of the local bureaucrats. They have an autonomy in raising and spending taxes. So the more you respect private property, the more you respect the property of the private enterprises, first TVs, then private enterprise, the more taxes you can raise and the more you can spend. So very important point. And finally, you have a kind of princeling system, very keen movement from the Chinese bureaucracy in the new enterprises, private enterprise. The sons and the daughters, but probably more the sons, of the bureaucrats and the party veterans become the managers. And this way, the resistance of the old guard of party veterans could be bought off in favor of privatization. So these three elements were, in fact, provided a kind of de facto alignment of the interests of the bureaucracy with the protection of private property, which induced, of course, the economic growth. But this is, of course, hitting the ceiling, and it is time, of course, for China that they are creating formal institutions of property rights, which they are doing now. The law has been voted in the popular Congress, the law which is placing private property, the protection of private property, at the same footing as public property. But still there is a problem in agriculture. Last point, this is contract. Contract is formalization of exchange. A lot of exchange goes on without contract, but in developed market systems with appropriate legal institution, contract law is a very crucial body, and exchanges the blood vein of the market. So this support by a formalized contract law is quite important. The classical rules of contract law, we know all: contractual freedom, there should be freedom to contract with whom and what you contract. Contractual compliance, you should keep your contracts, you pacta sunt servanda. Contractual liability, if you do not comply with the contract, you should pay damages or specific performance. And good faith execution. In the execution of contract, you should always try to minimize the costs of the execution. That, at least, is the law and economics interpretation of good faith execution. But that are the most basic rules in a contract law conducive for markets. Within a planned economy, you have also contract law, but contract law has a total other aim than the classical contract law. The classical contract law is to support for the exchange system in the market. In a planned economy, contract law is in fact a kind of regulation how two arms of the bureaucracy can cooperate. So the hierarchy is introducing all kind of regulation how two inferior tiers of the bureaucracy can cooperate. So this is a quite different type of contract law. In China, also here, you can remark this gradual evolution from this concrete type of contract law, how bureaucracy A and B are entitled to cooperate, to an abstract order of contracts and contract law. The actors in the contractual system were the autonomous bureaucracies and the autonomous enterprises who developed gradually an immense network throughout China of interconnection, demand and supply, and so on. In the first phase, basically, we can say that this whole contractual network did not rely on formal contract law. It relied on what is called in China guanxi. I explained this later. It's a kind of informal system, guanxi. I have to say this is not specific for China. We should not exaggerate the cultural gap between the West and China in this respect, because a lot of studies have pointed out that also in the West, informal relationships, tit-for-tat relationship, repeated games, repeated playing, is very important with regard to contractual compliance. The Rotary Club is probably much more important for contractual compliance than the court, than the civil court. A lot of studies, like for instance the empirical study of Macaulay, has pointed this out. So China is not so exceptional, but what is typical for China is that the contractual system operated during years and years on this informal base. In China, you had contract law in 1981, the economic contract law, very bureaucratic, foreign contract law with foreign companies, and the technology contract law, which is mainly about the transfer of technology and knowledge. These are really long lists of regulations. They are quite different from a contract law, a body of general rules, as we have in the capitalist private law, the civil law, and the common law. Very unclear and impossible to enforce. Because if you want to enforce that, you have to negotiate with all bureaucracies. So it's a quite different system from us. Only in 1999, a unified contract law was established, reflecting more or less classical principles of contract law. But remember, the big evolution towards TVEs, towards private enterprise, towards a market system occurred before 1999. So that is very important to realize. And the reliance and compliance within contract was mostly based on the so-called guanxi. Guanxi is a notion within China which is a kind of buddyship commitment. Guanxi means that you're a buddy, which is something less strong than a friend. A friend is a very personal relationship, but stronger than a partner. A partner is typically a business relationship based on interest, occurring in a quite anonymous context. Buddyship is something in between. So social ties based on frequent face-to-face interaction. It's also, of course, stimulated by family ties. A very strong notion within China. And that is the base for the fact that this exchange system, contract system, could operate during a long time without the support of formal contractual relationships. There are a couple of researches, empirical researches made it on this. The first one is made by a Chinese scholar, Zhu Wei. I have to look for the name. Chinese names are, for me, difficult to remember. And I guess the same is for the Chinese with my name, Zhu Zhuanggong. And he made a poll, he made an extensive research on how parties identify their contractual partners. And there they pointed out that social networks, these social networks based on guanxi, were for 47%, accounted for 47%, advertisement, 47%, government sources, because the government is still maintaining its prominent role in whole this economy. They just ignore the government system because this is giving only 6.6% of attention in identifying your contractual partners. Identifying suppliers and customers, you get, this is another research made by Whiting, you get about the same figures. Business associate, trade conferences are the most important things in order to identify your suppliers and your customers. These personalized networks are very crucial. If we look to dispute resolution, this World Bank study in 2001 pointed out that in 87% the disputes were solved by by negotiation and not by suits in the court. that also the relationship between client, relationship with client, and 93% in the relationship with suppliers. Trade association, the government sets up trade associations where the people of the enterprises have to meet. They are government controlled. This illusion of the government that they still control the whole system. Mostly membership of these official trade associations is mandatory. So 67% of the businessmen are member, but only 4% rely on the information of this trade association, the information about the creditworthiness of the other partners. So again, you see that in China, the official system and the informal system is largely different, and that this government control on the economy is merely is an illusion. Gradually, however, courts are better organized. The contract law has been reshaped, as I told you before, and what you see is an annual growth of contract dispute resolution before the courses. If you look to the figures, you see an increase of 8% annually, while, for instance, for criminal cases, the increase is only 4%, which is quite important if you know that in China, criminal law is a very important branch, probably the most important branch of the law. No, nevertheless, civil cases are increases, which means that more and more the Chinese are also relying on their official, on their formal institutions in order to support the exchange network developing within their country. There are a couple of figures also on enforcement of the Nanjing Court. Gradually, Chinese scholars are making empirical studies where, for instance, in 55% of the cases, the contractual enforcement was successfully implemented. So gradually, courts get a grip on contractual compliance. So this is a very interesting evolution, a contractual network developing on informal basis. Guangxi, buddyship commitment, gradually institutions are built in order to enforce this informally. It is time, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude because really I used a lot of your patience and we had a very charged day. A couple of general conclusions. First, historical conclusions. The Chinese reform process is a major shift in history. We should be aware of that. The Chinese had a quite market-driven economy until the 10th century under the Sung dynasty. Under the Sung dynasty, they were by far the richest country in the world and at the verge of industrial revolution. They had techniques for blast and industry and steel. And if the Mongol invasion had not come, I think the industrial revolution would have occurred somewhat in the 11th, 12th century in China. So, but from 1000 till 1300, the Mongol invasion destroyed really the country and put the country backward with a couple of centuries. Between 1300 and 1900, in order to avoid the same fate, the Ming and the Manchu dynasties introduced a very protectionist system within China with a lot of government controls. It allowed a growth and an expansion of the population, but this growth was merely a extensive growth, putting more land into exploitation and not an intensive growth in terms of more innovation and improvement of production techniques. Then you have the Marxist revolution, which disrupted profoundly during a certain time the economy on the countryside, which put the country again back for a couple of years, but not deeply enough to destroy everything. And the present market evolution means, in effect, that 1 billion people shift from the camp, if we can say it like that, from the camp of the planned economy, from socialist economy to a market economy. Even when Europe does the opposite and shifts from a market economy to a socialist economy, I'm very pessimistic now, then it's still, the net result is still a plus. 1 billion Chinese moved to a market economy and 400 million Europeans moved to a socialist economy, so there is still a surplus of 600 million. So we should be optimistic in this way. Other point, theoretically, what conclusions we can draw from this evolution on the theoretical level? First, that the evolution on the economic point, on the economic side, and the evolution on the institutional side show here a co-evolutionary character. By changing some elements in the system, an accumulative process of unintended consequences is started, by which more other changes are triggered off, and the result is a total change in the whole system. It also means that a constructivist imposition of liberal institution is not always necessary. It suffices that the leadership is more or less committed to long-term economic growth. They don't have to be liberals, but they have to commit themselves to long-term economic growth, and then they will take step-by-step reforms which are driving the system towards more liberalization. We have examples of that also in Eastern Europe. I think the Czech Republic is a major example of a similar evolution. Secondly, there is the importance of grown values and grown order is also illustrated by this evolution. The ingrained family structure, the ingrained Guanxi morality of Confucius played a major role in easing the evolution towards a market system. Trust, social capital was not totally destroyed by the collectivist, and the new evolution towards a market economy could rely on these grown values within the system. And a last general conclusion, dear friends, is that the paths to freedom are multiple, and that constitutes a hope for the future. And I thank you very much for your attention.